Hello, my name is Mark Gibson, and you're listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost series, a weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. So today we're going to be looking at the role of woodlands, the role they have to play in protecting water quality. And to discuss this, I'm joined by Kevin Collins, Forestry Inspector with the Department of Agriculture. Kevin, you're very welcome to our webinar this morning. Kevin, your role in the forestry inspectors, you're based in the environment section, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, Mark. And it's a wide-ranging job, a wide-ranging brief. It covers things like working on the native woodland scheme and the neighbourhood scheme, to working on initiatives around End Harrier and freshwater pearl mussel, drafting up requirements for environmental protection during afforestation and felling, and a lot of work with a colleague of mine called Ken Buck on water issues and working with the water community, particularly around the Water Framework Directive, to try and figure out ways to solve issues that are there with old forests in particular, but also to look at ways in which woodlands and forests can be used to protect water. So it's a kind of a very varied, wide-ranging brief, but it's good. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Great. Well, look, if you could share your screen with us, so Kevin, and we'll get on to the presentation. So the format, for those of you who aren't familiar with the format this morning, Kevin will give a short presentation, about 25 minutes, and we'll take questions afterwards, and we'll endeavour to get through as many of your questions at the end of the presentation. So really looking forward to your presentation, Kevin. So I'll hand over to you.
Delighted to be here. Delighted to be able to talk about woodlands for water, and ways in which we can use forests to protect and enhance water quality. It's particularly refreshing now to talk about this, just because there are lots of initiatives going on in the area of water, through the second cycle of the Water Framework Directive, and also as we enter into the third cycle of the Water Framework Directive. So forests have an awful lot to offer in terms of ways in which we can protect and enhance water. And that's what I'd like to look at today. My colleague Ken Buck was also to be present to present this. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here, but he's very much part of this presentation also. So, if I could just very briefly, one or two words about the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine in terms of forestry. I won't say any more except to say that we have two key roles. One is in terms of regulation. In order to afforest or to fell trees or to develop a forest road or even to apply aerial fertilization, there's a requirement for a license from the Forest Service, from the Minister of Agriculture, Food and the Marine. And within that, therefore, we have to look at each application that comes in from the perspective of silvicultural requirements, but also environmental requirements. And within that, things like the Habitats Directive and the Water Framework Directive and the EIA Directive very much come into focus. So that's one role that we have, is in terms of the regulation of forestry activity. And we cover the private sector and Quilcha. But the other side of what we do is very much along the lines of promoting sustainable forest management via funding that we offer for different forestry activities. For example, the afforestation scheme is there, offering 12 different options for developing different types of forests. We have funding for forest roads, for tending and thinning, for CCF, continuous cover forestry. Also native woodland conservation, along with a native woodland establishment element within the afforestation scheme itself. The neighbourhood scheme to develop public amenities, woodland amenities close to where people live. And also just released there last week, this new scheme for woodland creation on public lands. And this effectively is funding public bodies developing native woodland for ecosystem services on public land. So it's a new scheme that has just rolled out. And the policy is there, but very much about the right tree in the right place, and trying to maximize the benefits that forestry can bring in terms of economics, in terms of social issues, and in terms of the environment. So it's all about very much kind of looking to see what the right tree is in the right place. And in that, forestry has grown over, rapidly over the last century. We now have around 11% of the land area under forest cover. Obviously, it's forming a massive carbon sink. It generates lots of economic activity. Now, almost half of our forests are under private ownership. So that's a big shift in ownership, primarily due to planting by farmers and other private landowners over the last 2 decades or so. And we're just scraping the 30% broadleaf cover. So we're almost at the point where broadleaf cover is 30%. So while it's a vibrant industry from the point of view of producing a product that generates employment and income, we also have a very strong focus on ecosystem services. And these, so, you know, in terms of employment, everything from the nursery sector through to the realizing the timber from the forest, right through to haulage and sawmills, processing, what have you. So all the way through the stream, there are opportunities for employment and economic activity. But also ecosystem services, these very important co-benefits are very much part of our forest policy. Carbon, obviously carbon capture being a massive part of that. Alternative sources of energy, biodiversity, you know, how do we use forests and woodlands to enhance biodiversity, for example, at the farm level, but also at the wider landscape level. You know, speaking of landscape, the role of forests in terms of enhancing landscapes. And also amenity and recreation is a massive part now in terms of, you know, realizing the importance of having good quality woodland amenities where people live to visit, so that all the benefits in terms of the physical well-being, mental well-being, opportunities for education, you know, celebration of local heritage, all these issues come to the fore. So they're all part of the mix. But also very important is water, and the idea that, you know, we have to be very careful under the Water Framework Directive and the Habitats Directive in terms of how we regulate forestry activity to make sure that it doesn't impact negatively on water quality, but also to look at ways in which we can use forests proactively to deliver benefits in terms of the protection of water. And that's very much what I'm focusing on here today. So just to dive a little bit into the River Basin Management Plan for Ireland, the current one which we're in, which is the second cycle, it runs from 2018 to 2021. And there was a massive characterization process that took place before to identify basically the types of risks that our various water bodies were facing. And there's one category, at risk water bodies, where forestry is a significant pressure. And I just want you to look at that map very, very quickly, and just to keep it in your mind's eye, if you will. Just a little bit of background in terms of where we've come from historically. Ireland, you know, as we emerged from the Ice Age, very quickly developed a very strong woodland cover. Up to maybe 85% of the island was covered with forests of one type or another. And then as the climate changed and as people began clearing forests, you can see the dramatic decline to where we were at just 1% at the beginning of the 20th century. And since then, we're now at 11%, which over 120 years is a fairly phenomenal land use change. And the graph on the right-hand side gives you a bit more detail about how we have made that change take place. You can see the planting that's happened each year since 1922. Well, not each year, but a number of years since 1922. And the green bars represent planting carried out by the state, and the red bars are where private planting has taken place. So you can see very much a shift since the late 1980s, where farmers and other private landowners came in with the help of supports available and advice from agencies such as Teagasc and registered foresters and what have you, and began taking over, if you like, the planting program and beginning to dominate it. And you can see that primarily all planting is now carried out in the private sector. Although this new scheme that came out last week might just add a little bit more green into that mix. But that's where we've come basically historically. I just want to say just two graphs here, just don't want to throw too many graphs at you, but in terms of the overall characterization that took place behind the Water Framework Directive, the second cycle, overall, forestry was seen as being the fourth most significant risk relating to at-risk water bodies, and these are water bodies which are at risk of falling back in their status. So forestry was seen as being the fourth most significant pressure, but critically, in terms of these high ecological status objective water bodies, where these are particularly important from an ecological point of view, and where particular focus is shining. forestry is deemed to be the most significant. And how that is because there's a very strong overlap between legacy forestry sites and these types of landscapes. And if I just throw this map up again, where you have a map on the left-hand side showing where these at-risk water bodies are, and then on the right-hand side you get a flavour of where forests in Ireland are generally distributed. And you can see the upland areas where there's concentration of these at-risk water bodies often correlates strongly with older state planting in terms of kind of the older portion of our forest estate. So there is a real strong legacy issue there. So it's undoubted that there can be issues if you have a poorly sited, designed and managed forest. It can lead to negative impacts. However, if we appropriately site, design and manage forests, it can also deliver very important water-related ecosystem services and also play an important role in meeting the Water Framework Directive objectives. So really it's about how, and this is the Forest Service's position in terms of the Water Framework Directive and the focus of our work, it's how do we minimize legacy issues and problems that are being created by having forest plantations, for example, on peat in very sensitive upland areas within these high status water body catchments. How do we manage those? How do we extract timber? How do we fell the trees? How do we reforest or maybe decide not to in some particular cases in order to minimize that potential for impact? But also on the other side of it, how do we look at ways in which we can develop woodland and forests in a way that begin to practically deliver benefits in terms of water quality? So it's really about eliminating A and promoting B. And that's really what we're really focused on doing now in terms of water. And I mentioned we had a number of different schemes to promote different types of forestry. And one package we have, which we've worked on for the last 2 decades very closely with a number of stakeholders, is the Native Woodland Scheme package. And this has really come together because of input from the likes of Woodlands of Ireland, who are a very, very important body in this whole area, National Parks and Wildlife, Inland Fisheries Ireland, the Heritage Council, and a wide range of other native woodland stakeholders. We all came together to develop a scheme that would provide funding into the area of native woodland. Obviously for all the different biodiversity benefits and cultural reasons as to why native woodlands are so important, being such a threatened part of our national heritage, but also in ways in which we can maximize the ecosystem benefits that we can get from native woodlands. For example, those relating to water. So the Native Woodland Scheme, it has 2 packages within it, or 2 schemes within it. One is the Native Woodland Conservation, and here are 2 photographs showing one application of that, where you're moving from a woodland that's has laurel, has non-native species such as beech, for example, and you're moving that over, you're restoring that into native woodland by removing those threats and replanting and fencing from deer and letting the woodland ecosystem begin to recover. But also we can provide funding for the conversion of forest stands to native woodland. And this is very important in terms of dealing with those legacy sites where we do have forests in areas which we would not plant nowadays. So how do we move those into something more appropriate? So people have used this scheme in this way, whereby the conifer stand is felled and it's reforested with native woodland. And that provides a very important buffer behind which, you know, the reforestation with conifers can take place. But you have a very, very robust native woodland buffer there along the adjoining the ecosystem, the aquatic zone. So very important protective function. But we also have, as part of the Native Woodland Scheme package, this Native Woodland Establishment Scheme. And this is all about developing new native woodland on open greenfield sites. And this has the highest granted premium rate available under the afforestation scheme. You can see the rate there is €6,222 per hectare to actually develop the actual woodland, to get the trees in the ground and fenced off and maintained to year 4, plus also an annual premium for 15 years of €680 per hectare. So it's quite an attractive from that perspective. And again, it's focused on native woodland expansion and also ways in which we can deliver ecosystem services to that landscape, including those relating to water. So a couple of applications here. I just want to bring you through, if you like, a typical native woodland establishment cycle, where you have a process where the plan is developed, and you have input from the professional forester working with the landowner. Often an ecologist is involved as well. The scheme requires people to identify what the most appropriate native woodland type is for that particular area, what would occur there naturally over time, and then we try to replicate that. Very important conditions about, for example, where the seed comes from. Is it native from within Ireland to conserve genetic biodiversity? We have a requirement for minimum site input in terms of minimal cultivation and minimal fertilizer input. It's all about trying to match trees to the site, and in that way those trees have the best chance of leaping out from the ground. And you can see the example there on the bottom left-hand corner of a pioneer birch woodland planted under the native woodland scheme, and that's at year 5 or 6, I think. So those trees are over 2 meters tall, and there was a requirement for deer fencing that area, so that's another issue that we have to be very aware of. But very quickly, over a short period of time, these native woodlands begin to impress themselves in the landscape. And you can see there, just on the top right-hand side, a picture of a native woodland planted down in Dunmanway in Cork. And that was at year 7 or 8, I think it was. That was an ash oak woodland. And you can see with the people walking through it, how quickly the canopy emerges. And very quickly, natural processes take over. For example, seed fall drops into the woodland. Natural processes occur. Animals and plants begin to find a home there. And although it might be planted quite regularly and artificially, within maybe a dozen years, these natural processes really begin to have an impact on the ecology of these new woodlands. And over time, they gradually become more and more diverse and more settled. And very quickly, though, the benefits in terms of biodiversity, etc., come to the fore. But the key one we want to focus on here is that in relation to water. So here's just an example of, this is actually the very first site planted under the native woodland scheme in Ballyvarry up in County Mayo. And that field there, rough grazing field, was planted with a mixture of birch and other species. And over time, you can see that photograph in the bottom left-hand side, it's what the site looks like, I think 18 years later. And what you have there basically is you have an unplanted water setback, which allows for the natural riparian vegetation to come to the fore, to act as an additional kind of buffer, but also as a kind of a wildlife corridor. And then behind that, you have the canopy of native woodland beginning to emerge very strongly. And you can see that being used as part of on-farm mitigation, for example, in terms of the protection of water, but also on-farm measure in terms of biodiversity and landscape and all of these other benefits and services that are very much to the fore. So even very small buffers placed in individual fields, we don't need to go any more than 20 meters wide, for example. Even those very, very small buffers can provide massive benefits in terms of the protection of water. And the benefits are very large and very varied. For example, having a native woodland buffer like this, it has been shown to reduce sediment mobilization and runoff into watercourses. So you have a buffer basically of natural vegetation, which can pull out sediment and nutrients that might come through it from overland flow. Stabilizes banks. So there is a big issue, I know, in many areas of banks being washed out and eroded, particularly with these kind of storm events that we are now seeing more and more of. So by having this kind of approach where you begin to stabilize the actual bank with riparian vegetation, strengthened by riparian species such as willow, for example, that aids that process in terms of restoring the stability of our banks. Input of food, for example, the leaf drop of native species into the water itself, that provides a food source and a source of energy for the aquatic ecosystem. So, that's a very, very important part of the aquatic ecosystem. Provides shading and cooling of water. Now, we're not talking about having trees all the way along the watercourse, which would lead to tunneling, but there are situations where small groups of trees can be planted along the riverbed or along the stream bank. And that can provide very important shade and a very important cooling effect. And there is an issue nowadays, particularly during summer months, where with low flows in the water and high temperatures, where you have negative impacts in terms of aquatic ecosystems and aquatic life, fish, for example. So this cooling effect can be very, very important. This approach can also help regulate floodwater in terms of putting in place natural flood retention measures to slow down the flow of water over the landscape, and also to provide these sinks where the water is stored and released gradually over time. And as I mentioned before, the whole restoration of the riparian ecosystem. And you can see the photograph there, for example, where natural processes begin to take off, and suddenly you have a habitat forming for the likes of kingfisher and otter and other kind of linchpin species. So very, very important from the point of view of riparian ecosystem restoration. And that in itself develops these biodiversity corridors along our watercourses. So we've dived into this area in a big way within the department, and we produced this document, Woodland for Water, which really just tries to present this approach into the water community. And we did this for the second cycle of the Water Framework Directive. So it's available online, and we have explored each of these benefits and dived into the literature to pull out the whatever research is there to underline the case. So that might be a document that people might want to dive into to get more information about this area. But of course, other co-benefits arise from this approach. There's a number of different types of wood products that can be gained by the landowner. Everything from this coppice restoration project in Ballyvarry again in Mayo, smaller market, but nevertheless very valuable produce like charcoal and bespoke furniture, firewood, and also on the right-hand side, the ability to grow very valuable saw logs, for example, over time. So that also forms part of the native woodland scheme, where it is compatible with native woodland ecosystems and the biodiversity. And by managing these forests using continuous cover forestry principles, realizing this type of wood is possible from these native woodlands, and it is encouraged where appropriate. I mentioned the whole issue of on-farm biodiversity, but also the biodiversity begins to develop at a landscape level by planting these native woodlands along watercourses. There's a range of plants and animals there. And not to forget on the bottom right-hand side, just a small diagram of what happens under the ground, because most of the biodiversity in our native woodlands is under our feet in terms of everything happening there. So just to flag that with people watching. Other very important ecosystem services, carbon capture, of course. People, the idea that these native woodlands, landowners may be open to providing access to local communities, for example. The whole idea of connecting with Ireland's deep past. There's a picture here of a large canoe in the National Museum in Dublin, which just gives an indication of what type of trees, the very stature of the trees that existed on this island in times past. So by creating native woodlands, it just gives us that little window into the deep past, as well as all these other benefits, including water benefits. So there's a whole strong community now emerging in Ireland regarding native woodlands. We have, with the scheme, developed a number of training courses with Woodlands of Ireland, where we've brought ecologists and foresters together to look at ways in which we can develop native woodlands, new native woodlands, and restore existing native woodlands. We also see the native woodland scheme being used on a trial basis to develop new native woodlands down in Kerry with the Kerry Life project, which is focusing on land management for the conservation of freshwater pearl mussel. So that's a very exciting application of the scheme in that regard. But just one other scheme as well I'd like to touch on very briefly, the agroforestry scheme. And this again is a scheme that we feel has potential in terms of the protection of water. And agroforestry is a system very, very common over in Europe. And what it does, it allows the landowner to develop a crop of timber, if you like, by planting widely spaced trees. And in between the trees, they're able to continue farm activity. And in this case here in Ireland, we're talking about silvopastoral systems, whereby beneath the trees planted, grazing and fodder growth is also encouraged. So the scheme is just starting off, and it's been on the road for a couple of years, and there is an awful lot of interest in it. And this is another way in which woodland can be developed in a way that would enhance water quality, because what happens in these areas that are planted is a reduction in the level of intensity. For example, you have a much denser sward developing, and overall you have better infiltration of water, for example, increased biodiversity. So it's another way in which forestry can be used to protect water quality. A few other measures that are also coming to the fore in terms of schemes we offer that can be used to protect water. We have a continuous cover forestry scheme, which is about managing woodlands towards continuous cover forestry. So the likes of a conifer stand, an even-aged conifer stand, for example, will be managed over time into a continuous cover forest. With species diversity, age diversification, etc. And what that does, it avoids us having to clear fell those areas, which can expose soil to rainwater and create issues for water quality. I mentioned before this new scheme, the Woodland Creation on Public Land scheme, and this is focused on public bodies looking at their land bank and seeing opportunities for developing new native woodland using the native woodland scheme requirements. So, we're very much for ecosystem delivery. So carbon capture, water protection, biodiversity, these are all parts of what public bodies are trying to achieve, and they have commitments in these areas. So this scheme is designed to realize that land bank, if you like, and realize that opportunity for developing new native woodland. I also want to mention the Woodland Environmental Fund, which is in operation for over a year now. And this is where we are bringing businesses into the process of native woodland creation by getting them to add additional funds to the grant we offer to tip landowners into a decision to go with native woodland. So the idea is that a business might become associated with a local native woodland developed by a local farmer, and in that way the business is able to point towards that in terms of its commitment to carbon capture, biodiversity, the protection of water, etc. So that's another very important opportunity in this area. And of course, also, as part of all afforestation and reforestation projects, there's a range of requirements and standards that must be adhered to regarding the protection of water. Probably first and foremost among those is this water setback, whereby you must leave an area of unplanted, uncultivated land along the aquatic zone and along relevant water courses, for example, drains, and water-related hotspots, wetter areas within the site. So that we have this protective buffer of natural ground vegetation to try to capture any sediment and any nutrients that might move off the site itself. So that forms part of all of our activities in terms of afforestation, in terms of clear fell, tree felling, reforestation, etc. And for details, have a look at the environmental requirements of afforestation and the standards for felling and reforestation. They're on the department website, which I'll leave on my last slide. So they're also very important. That's kind of real bread and butter protective measures that are built into all of our licenses. So finally, just to get across again the idea, a couple of aerial shots, and these are taken from the web. It's just to demonstrate how native woodlands can be used as part of on-farm mitigation to protect water quality. So the idea of developing these permanent semi-natural habitats close to aquatic zones, close to streams and rivers, and also along important drains, for example, and how effective they can be in terms of intercepting sediment and nutrients, in restoring the ecological functionality, if you like, of the riparian zone and the aquatic zone, and how they also deliver lots of other co-benefits in terms of biodiversity, the landscape, the opportunity for timber, for example, and wood products for the landowner, him or herself, and how they can impact at a farm level, but also very much at a landscape level. And if you pull back away from the map, if you like, of a locality and visualize the idea of having pockets of native woodland strung out along a watercourse going through a landscape, and those woodlands located strategically where the benefits that they deliver to water are maximized, that would really maximize the opportunity for how forests can deliver benefits in relation to protection, enhancement, and enhancement of water quality. So if you like, the real kind of a nub of the issue, nub of the problem is how do we achieve the idea of a landscape approach? How do we achieve this idea of identifying within an area where ideally pockets of native woodland should go in order to protect the watercourse, and then how to bring landowners in together and to realize that vision in a coordinated way. So we have lots of the tools to make this happen, but we still have to get over that little hurdle, if you like, to bring it all together. But having done that, we're well on the way to this kind of image, and this is from the second cycle of the Water Framework Directive, just giving an idea of the different land uses that take place within any one water catchment. And you can see there how small woodlands, hedgerows, pockets of trees, for example, are very important within the landscape itself, in terms of slowing down water, in terms of natural water retention measures. The idea of there is definitely a place for commercial conifer plantations and commercial conifer forests in terms of an economic backbone of Irish forestry. And how do we manage those in a way that protects and enhances water quality? And also, how do we engineer in more native woodland, more continuous cover forestry, more of these semi-natural permanent areas along our aquatic zones to really maximize the potential that trees, woodlands and forests have in terms of protecting and enhancing water quality. So it's all very, very exciting work at the moment that's going on under the Water Framework Directive, and particularly the third cycle. And we're very much working closely with them and also with partners such as Woodlands of Ireland in terms of further refining and enhancing the native woodland scheme. And I'm also very hopeful with this new scheme targeting public lands that we'll also see significant areas of native woodland being developed in that sector, if you like, also focus on things like carbon, biodiversity and water quality. So that's very exciting as well. So Mark, I'm running out of steam here. We're running out of breath. So I just want to leave people with my contact details and also contact details of Ken, my colleague, who also works very closely with me on the Water Framework Directive issues. I also want to throw up there our colleagues in Teagasc, the forestry advisors, who are also always available to talk with landowners about opportunities for forestry. So they'd be well aware of this whole area. And also Joe Garran of Woodlands of Ireland. And I mentioned before, we've always worked very closely with Woodlands of Ireland on developing the native woodland scheme and developing this application of it. So Joe is now there heading this effort with Woodlands of Ireland. So I just want to throw up his contact details as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin. That was an excellent presentation. Really enjoyed those slides where you can see the before and after effect. Particularly over a long period, the effect of that margin and then your forestry setback. It's very visual. Lots of excellent questions coming through. But before we get to the questions, I suppose it's a general point that has been made to me on several occasions. I own a little bit of forestry myself, but I often have a chat with the forestry industry around the environmental side of forestry, and there is a view out there that the environmental restrictions are over restrictive and slowing down the rate of growth. So the graph that you showed there, showing the inventory since 1922. I mean, there's been a very sharp increase over that period, but I think, are we seeing a flattening in that curve?
Yeah, Mark, we are. I mean, in one way, I'm delighted to be here because it takes me away from what currently is dominating my work and the work of a number of my colleagues. It's dealing with this backlog that is built up within the licensing system. As we rapidly change our appropriate assessment procedure to meet the legal requirements. So, and you might be aware that we're dramatically upskilling with ecological resources within the inspectorate. We now have 6 or 7 full-time ecologists and a similar number that we were working with on a consultancy basis. And we have now a very detailed plan to start moving through this backlog that has built up. So Yeah, there are very stringent environmental requirements and procedures that we do have to go through, particularly in relation to appropriate assessment, which is, the basis for the backlog, because there is a sharp focus on forestry at the moment, and there have been changes in the interpretation or clarifications in the interpretation of the Habitats Directive at an EU level and also in the national courts. So we're emerging from that very dense 2-year period of turmoil. And we're now beginning to move through files, albeit slowly at first, but hopefully over time that'll speed up. So yes, there is that kind of dichotomy insofar as we are trying to promote a land use that, if done properly and if well cited, has all of these benefits, environmental benefits. But at the same time, we're held back by these environmental requirements. But the two aren't necessarily exclusive. We just need to get the environmental requirements sorted during the application process, and then that'll let us really, go for it in terms of delivering forests which tick all the boxes. So yeah, we are in this period of change at the moment. It's challenging.
That target you mentioned of 18% target cover by 2046, is there a breakdown of that, or is that are there any interim goals or dates for that target?
Well, it's kind of hard to set too precise interim goals. I mean, generally it's kind of 30% broadleaf planting as part of the afforestation program. And, each forestry program that comes along, we're currently at the end of the current forestry program. So there'll be a new forestry program being developed now, and that'll have its own targets as well. So it's kind of constant adjustment, because along the way we do hit these massive issues. For example, we've gone through the whole process with the ash dieback, which had a big impact in terms of our broadleaf planting, and we lost ash from the afforestation program, which is a wonderful native broadleaf that farmers and other landowners had real connection with. So that, we've had issues with massive catastrophic windblow, for example. We're now going through a regulatory challenge, which hopefully we're beginning to emerge from, albeit very slowly. So, we will meet other challenges on the way, but I think we'll also see opportunities emerging. And I mentioned the new scheme we have in terms of reaching out to the public sector and reaching out to businesses, for example. And that has realized a lot of different opportunities in terms of native woodland. And I think it'll continue to do so. So it's hard to kind of predict too far how we're going to achieve that end target, but it's like it's on a program to program basis.
Okay, Kevin, we're getting a lot of interesting questions coming through here, so we'd better get to them. So the first question here is, if the native woodland scheme is so attractive, why has uptake been disappointing, and what policy measures are needed to change this?
Well, the target under the forestry program was 450 hectares per year. And before the current slowdown hit us, we were beginning to, I think we were exceeding that actually. I think we reached 500 hectares per year. It did take time to build up within the current forestry program, but we were beginning to hit that target for 1 or 2 years. And then unfortunately, we're into this process, into this period here where we have this logjam. But I think that in terms of the percentage of afforestation that is being approved now, native woodland is probably making up quite a significant portion of that. And we do see an ongoing increase in interest in the scheme among the mainstream forestry sector, if you like. Like for a long period, native woodland creation, there are always operators who are very keen on doing it and landowners who are very, very keen on realizing new native woodland. But it's very much over the last couple of years moved into the mainstream. And what we are really pushing, and we're beginning to see it now, is that native woodland plots form part of a general afforestation. So you might have an afforestation project involving GPC3, which is primarily Sitka spruce, for example, with 15% broadleaves and 15% open space, plus plots of native woodland adjoining watercourses within the more sensitive areas, for example, of the project area. So that type of mix and match is really where we'd love to go with the native woodland. And we're seeing it become like that as it becomes more and more mainstream within the forestry sector.
What about, Kevin, for grassland farmers, tillage farmers? How attractive are these schemes, and how do they interact with existing schemes such as the the basics, payment schemes and so on, how are they, do they, are they compatible, and will farmers sacrifice much payment if they opt
Yeah.
for those schemes?
Well, I think the main kind of challenge is the footprint of the land itself, in terms of the option the farmer has to continue with tillage or dairy, for example, versus what goes in under trees physically. So that is in terms of the loss of the productivity, and that's why we're in those areas. We're trying to stress that even very small areas planted with native woodland can have major benefits in terms of protecting water, in terms of on-farm biodiversity, etc. So, very small strips of native woodland in key areas on the farm may not take up that much footprint, but can deliver, a wide range of these benefits, and really kind of engineer into the farm landscape a permanent mitigation in terms of water quality, in terms of biodiversity. So we fund native woodlands down to 20 meters in width, plus 10-meter wide aquatic setback. So we're looking at a 30-meter strip. Now that can get narrower as well in pinch points. So it's not like a straight line, if you like. So along the watercourse, but also there might be areas elsewhere on the farm which can act as a source of issues. For example, it could be a wet area, or around farm buildings, for example, where pockets of native woodland can be effective as water retention measures. So we can get down to that type of width. Now, obviously, there is an opportunity there to blend seamlessly into what the other environmental agri schemes offer, for example, in terms of smaller pockets of tree planting and individual tree planting. But in terms of native woodland, that's what we can go down to. So in terms of the land take within a tillage farm, carefully identified areas can make all the difference if they are brought into native woodland.
Okay, very good. We have a question in relation to that conversion of I think of existing plants, yes, or plantations. What conditions need to be met to be eligible to convert a conifer plantation to native woodland under the Native Woodland Scheme conservation?
Okay. Well, yeah, there are. I mean, there's a scheme document on the website, and that lists around 7 or 8 different criteria. And if you hit one of those, games on, if you like, potentially you're eligible for funding. So things like, are you adjacent to a known ancient native woodland, for example, or are you within a water sensitive area? Is there a particular focus on designated areas, for example? So there are a list of criteria, and if you meet one of those, well, then you're open to that. And what I'd say about that application of the scheme, we have seen it take place down, for example, in Kerry Life. We have seen it in other areas of the country where a stand of conifers has been clear-felled or is about to be clear-felled, and it's deemed, because of the sensitivity of the site in terms of designations or in terms of water, it will be more appropriate to go back in there in native woodland. So the most recent number of examples have come about under Kerry Life down in the Carra and Blackwater, as part of the work down there to conserve freshwater pearl mussel in terms of farming and forestry. So we've seen a couple of exciting applications of that scheme down there. So yeah, those are the types of conditions that are required.
Interesting question here about the role of forestry and woodlands in controlling flooding. Which woodlands, or is there evidence here to show the extent of which woodlands reduce surface runoff and thereby downstream flooding?
Yeah, I know of 1 or 2 research projects which are underway, which haven't been published yet, which kind of begin to dip into this from the Irish perspective. There's also under the Water Framework Directive and the Flood Framework Directive work going on within Ireland on developing natural water retention measures involving the EPA and other water-based bodies, and ourselves and other, like the Department of Agriculture generally. So as part of that, the idea of small woodlands, hedgerows, trees, that forms part of the suite of measures that group is looking at. But there is good examples from the UK and from elsewhere in Europe, which looks at small catchments and relates the tree cover in those catchments, particularly hedgerows and small woodlands, with the reduction in floodwater and the holding back of the floodwater. But one thing I would say in this, and we've made this very clear, like trees and woodlands and forests aren't the only solution. It has to be as part of a wider catchment approach in terms of other measures that are happening in there if we want to do this. But certainly I remember around 12, 13 years ago going over to Scotland with Woodlands of Ireland and Inland Fisheries Ireland to look at examples over there where they have used woodlands to reduce flooding and in that way to avoid spending large capital on hardcore engineering solutions in downstream villages. So they saw the economic benefit of moving funds from the engineering solution to the upstream natural solutions. So they're putting their money where their mouth was, if you like. So that was very, very reassuring and very enlightening to see.
Yeah, I saw a similar example over in New York City where they decided to opt for, rather than expensive water treatment plants and so on, it was agri-environmental schemes that they chose to put their money into. And it has been very successful. The question here in relation to invasive species such as rhododendron, are measures taken to protect new native forestry from these, and how is it done?
Yeah, I mean, rhodo is a real scourge in terms of native woodland, and you'll be very, very familiar with kind of some of the jewels in our national crown and the difficulties rhododendron presents within those in terms of kind of crowding out the natural ground flora and fauna. So it is a real threat, and where we see it as being the biggest issue in terms of our interaction with landowners with the native woodland scheme is in woodland restoration, where you have an existing woodland that might have beech, might have rhododendron, laurel, for example, and how to control rhododendron within that context, because cutting it and spraying it, and if necessary, or we've seen chipping, we've seen burying, we've seen stem injection, and all of which, depending on the level of infestation, it's back-breaking work. It's really expensive. It's very hard, and it's only as good as the follow-up monitoring, if you like, because it can very quickly reappear again. So we have funded projects where rhododendron removal was part of the mix of measures needed to restore woodlands, and there are examples around the country of this. But we see the largest challenge is, having invested in that, then the danger of the species reinvading the woodland through adjoining seed sources. And so the need for ongoing monitoring and ongoing maintenance until you have the natural ground flora up and away and the natural canopy in place, which themselves will slow down any infestation, if you like, in the future.
Okay, Kevin, the questions are coming taken fast here, so we better try and get through them as quick as we can. The question around air quality here, I know today's presentation is focused on water quality largely, but are you doing much work in relation to woodlands as a mitigating buffer around farms from air quality, especially ammonia emissions perspective? I know this is big in mainland Europe.
No, the answer to that is no. That really hasn't come up on our radar, except to say that I used to work in the urban forestry sector, and we still have a hand in that with the neighbourhood scheme, which is developing woodlands close to where people live, including urban woodlands. And so within that context, we're very aware of the benefits that trees and woodlands have in terms of urban air quality and trapping particulate pollutants, etc. So by extension of that, I would imagine that these types of woodlands would also have a benefit in terms of the application you're talking about. But I have to admit, it hasn't really popped up on our radar as an ecosystem service that we've thought about. But now you've raised it, maybe we should throw it into the mix and do a little bit of background research into it.
You talk about the the importance of a landscape approach to forestry planning and particularly riparian planting and so on. I mean, are there examples of that in Ireland where you have the various stakeholders have come together, the funding bodies, the local authorities, and so on. Has that happened? Or, you know, are there plans for that to happen?
Yeah, I mean, there are small examples where it's happened locally, for example. I'm thinking with the likes of Kerry Life, of course, of the Carra and Blackwater catchments. Duhallow as well is another life project where there was coordination between different land use sectors. You know, we are working closely with the EPA and the catchment unit there to try to figure out ways in which we can identify key areas, localities where native woodland would be very beneficial. And then, you know, ideas about how we then reach into that community and promote the idea of having more native woodland in that area and where to put it. We've also met very much with the local people in terms of their engagement with local communities and to raise the awareness there among those communities of the likes of the neighbourhood scheme as part of local developments along watercourses. You know, so we're kind of pushing those types of opportunities. There are examples where you have adjoining landowners, for example, Cuilcha National Parks and Wildlife, and there's one particular location out the west, which I'm thinking of, where you had a mixture of National Parks and Wildlife woodland, Cuilcha wood forest, conifer plantation, and also a private landowner strung out side by side, and all managing their areas in a consistent way to consolidate into a larger native woodland. So those are kind of examples of best practice, if you like, that are out there. But we don't have enough of them yet, I'm afraid, but striving for them.
We have a long question here, but if I could summarize it, there's a person here that feels that maybe farmers, you know, asking farmers to take a 30-meter strip alongside a watercourse, it may be too much of an ask. And is there a potential there to reduce that width, overall width that's needed?
Yes, and that's a really good question. And it was a real challenge that we had in Kerry Life, for example, because you had farms which were, you know, they had, you know, the best part of the farm, if you like, was down towards the watercourse, and yet we were asking for this scallop of land to go into native woodland. But how it transpired was that, you know, it doesn't need to be all the way along the watercourse, and it doesn't need to be in a kind of a solid line. It can be in small blocks as well. So, but there are opportunities for that 30 meters to come down at pinch points, for example. So it doesn't need to be a solid 30-meter band. So it can kind of breathe in and out, if you like, and it can melt down into nothing and then pick up again at the far end of the field and expand out again. So it's kind of looking at each field and looking at the topography, looking at where water flows, and, you know, focusing the woodland, if you like, where the water passes through, because that's where the benefits in terms of the vegetation within the forest, on the forest floor, absorbing sediments and nutrients as it passes through, as water passes through. So, you know, it's about looking at how water flows over the field and towards the watercourse, and locating the plot of woodland strategically to intercept that flow, if you like.
Okay. Question in relation to the level of impact of forestry clear felling, harvesting machinery and general harvesting operations on water quality, and particularly in high status sites and upland areas. What type of training, if any, would support forestry operators in terms of best practice? Is there, are there I know there are guidelines, but are there actual training or mandatory implementation of these guidelines?
Well, there is by de facto, because most of these forests have come about because of public planting in the past and are therefore managed by Cuilcha. So the majority of these kind of legacy sites in upland areas, they are managed by Cuilcha. And Cuilcha have a training program and a training program for a training requirement for its own contractors. So there's a whole kind of process in there. If you want to be a contractor working within a culture forest, you must undergo contractor training, and you must be certified as having done so. And they also have kind of checks and balances and inspections and what have you. So, you know, that's by de facto, that's where the training input is going. But there is, in terms of you know, issues and challenges around clear felling these areas, there is a requirement to clear fell them, because very often there is very limited room for opening up smaller coops or transfer them via continuous cover forestry, because these are very often even-aged uniform stands on peat. So if you begin to go in there and do any sort of selective removal to try to move it very gradually, often what happens is wind blow. And that's a real threat, because if you get that, you get a chaotic process whereby lots of sediment is generated, lots of impacts, trees falling over the watercourse. It doesn't become a controlled environment. Whereas if you can clear fell it, you can plan where machinery goes. There's requirements for exclusions, requirements for mat tracks, using brash mats. Harvesters and forwarders, which are the typical machinery used for these operations, are very low soil pressure machines. And if we can get that operation over and done with, well, then the reforestation can incorporate the likes of the water setback, can incorporate areas earmarked for native woodlands or continuous cover forestry. So at reforestation, we can restructure the forest that goes back in there so that we don't meet these issues again. And that's where the real kind of opportunity for proactive change is. It's how we restructure these forests after clear fell. But the operation of clear fell, it is a very sensitive one in terms of the potential impacts it can generate. So a lot of focus is on making sure that doesn't happen.
Kevin, we have a question here. We're just coming close to the end of today's session, so we're trying to squeeze one or two, if we can maybe brief in your responses. Is there any plan to award farmers who plant forestry any kind of carbon credits?
That is out of my area, but as far as I know, the answer is no.
Okay. So, and are there any discussions around this?
And again, I don't want to stray too far, unfortunately, because there are other people. I have so much on my plate. You know, there are other people who are working full time on that. Yes.
Okay. But there is work going on this.
Well, there are discussions going on about the whole issue of forests and carbon, and you know, you have COFOR Council inputting into it. It also comes up regularly with forestry representatives and farming representatives in discussions. So, you know, it's something that is boiling away all the time. Yes.
Okay, very good. Kevin, we're going to have to leave it there. There are more questions, but what I'll do is I'm going to send those questions on to you, and if it's possible, or if you think it's appropriate, maybe provide individual responses. We can provide you with contact details of the people who have submitted the question. Right. So look, thanks again, really and really positive feedback here from all of our viewers here about your excellent presentation today, so thank you for that. I just want to also thank our production team for organizing this series, Andy Boland, Pat Murphy and Yvonne Maher, and of course all of our partners. And so from myself today, and thank you for tuning in today. Next week we'll be hearing about energy in agriculture, and Barry Caslin is going to be joining us to talk about that. So we do join us next Friday at 9:30. So again, Kevin, thanks again for your time, and thanks for stepping in at a relatively short notice. So we do appreciate that.
Right, it's a pleasure. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the podcast version of the Teagasc Signpost series, the weekly webinar that promotes and examines sustainability in Irish farming. Don't forget to join us live every Friday morning for our latest webinar. For more, visit teagasc.ie. And you can also rate, review, and subscribe to the Signpost series on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Mark Gibson, and thanks for listening.